that looks at our New Zealand history in a lot more detail. So this is quite relevant to what the schools are going to be doing as well. So the Northern War has been called Honeyheke's War, the Flagstaff War, Honeyheke's Rebellion, which is a bit rich, I think. So I prefer a more neutral term such as the Northern War. And that's generally what it was called. And it's that famous image that we've got there that is just an imaginary image of someone, one of Honeyheke's men, cutting down the flagstaff. So just looking at the far north, the grey area. Now, if you can't see some of these slides, some of them, the smaller words are just there to prompt me to say certain things. But the grey area there is where the Ngāpui iwi is based. And so this area here, there's the Bay of Islands. And so the Bay of Islands is the area that we're talking about for this particular war. And it's perhaps not surprising that this was the area that saw conflict between the British and Maori first, because it was the area that had the most early contact. So we know about the explorers. The French and British explorers were here in the late 1700s. Cook was here in the 1770s, and there were French explorers here as well. There was a Frenchman called Marien Dufresne who was here in 1772, and he breached some sort of a tapu that he wouldn't have understood, and he was killed, and some of his people were eaten. And as a reprisal, his second in command, Crozet, killed about 250 Maori. And so that was the first example of conflict or warfare, if you like, between Europeans and Maori in New Zealand. After the explorers, there were whalers who came, mainly from America, but also British whalers as well. And then the timber traders and the flax traders, they came. The flax, of course, was tremendously valuable to turn into rope. If you think of all the sailing ships around the world and the miles and miles of rope that was required, New Zealand flax was good, and there was a whole industry built around scraping the flax down to the fibres and drying the fibres and then exporting those. And the kauri, they came looking for spars for naval ships, sailing ships, and kauri was particularly welcome. I've highlighted the Boyd, which was a trading vessel which went into Whangaroa Harbour in 1809 and was burnt to the ground, or burnt to the sea. The captain of the Boyd had been very harsh on a Maori who had been sailing on that ship, and so in reprisal his people burnt the ship to the sea and killed about 70 of the sailors. So these are some of the, so that early contact period in New Zealand was not without some atrocities and some real harshness. The missionaries arrived in 1814. You know about Samuel Marsden, Christmas Day, 1814. And the missionaries had quite a big effect on this area. There were lots of runaway sailors and convicts. Life on board a sailing ship was terrible. So if you could jump ship, it was quite an attractive option. And there were lots of sailors, convicts from the Australian colonies who had gotten away and had headed to the wild place of New Zealand, which was out of the reach of the British law. And so those sort of people were living in this area as well, in and around some of the Maori communities. And Maori were also going overseas. They were an adventurous people. They were signing up as early as 1805. A Maori went to London, and they would often jump on board. Young men would go on board the whaling ships or the trading ships. It was very common to go to Australia. That's in fact how Samuel Marsden met Maori from this area. They came over and he befriended them at his farm in Parramatta, and eventually got invited to come back to New Zealand. So the Maori were also travelling the world to some extent from this area. Now the missionaries were a key influence, and here's an image once again, just an imaginary image of Samuel Marsden preaching on Christmas Day 1814 and not only bringing Christianity but bringing European farming technology and other ideas to the Maori. And he had been invited. The guy standing next to him in the British jacket, the red jacket, is Ruatara, who was the chief who had met him and seen the farm that Marsden had in Parramatta and had learned something of the European ways and saw that there were some benefits for his people and brought Marsden over with some missionaries and carpenters and so on. Another big influence that leads up to the wars that we're going to be talking about is the Musket Wars. And the Musket Wars is the period of conflict in New Zealand in the 1820s and 30s when some Maori tribes, particularly Ngāpuhi in the first instance, got muskets. And with those muskets they were able to wage war on tribes throughout the rest of the North Island and even into the South Island. And I like this picture here because it shows the transition from traditional weaponry. So there's people dressed in traditional clothing doing a war dance. But if you have a look at what they're holding, some of them have got muskets, and those would have been flintlock muskets, and some of them have got hatchets or axes. And so this is the very first period where Maori are transitioning from their traditional handheld weapons into these European-style weapons, which gave them a tremendous advantage. I'll discuss that a little bit later. This is Hongi Pika. He was the dominant chief in the Ngāpuhi iwi in the 1820s, and he actually went to England with a missionary, Kendall, who was returning to the United Kingdom, and his express purpose was to come back with muskets. He thought he might get half a dozen, but he eventually came back with 300. He, as a side, a little bit of interest on the side, he went to Cambridge University and he helped Professor Lee translate Maori into a written language. So he would speak it, him and his brother Waikato would speak it. Professor Lee would work out how to write it, and that's how Te Reo Maori got turned into a written language, and the missionaries were able to learn that and come back and essentially write the Gospels in Maori. But when he came back, he waged war. Now you can't see the detail on there, but he waged war right through North Island with the muskets, and other tribes, of course, had to do anything they could to get muskets to try and resist. And so this is the start of the musket war period. Tauranga was attacked during this period, and some people from here went to the far north as slaves. And there's a whole story around that to do with the building of the pā here in 1864. So the main town is this one here, Kororareka. I had real trouble with that word, I'm sorry. It's difficult for me to sound it out. It translates as sweet penguin. And it's actually interesting at the moment. The New Zealand Geographic Board is looking at changing the name. There are submissions at the moment looking at changing the name from Russell back to Kororareka. This was the name of this little place, and this is an anchorage that the sailing ships would come into. There was fresh water down at this end. There was a freshwater spring, so the sailing ships could come in. They could load up. They could get food as well. They could get women. They could have grog. There were brothels and grog shops. It was actually it became a very nasty little place. In fact, it got given the name the Hellhole of the Pacific. It was some people would have called it a den of iniquity. The missionaries were on the other side over at Paihia, and they just couldn't believe what was happening. And actually what was happening here in Kororareka, in some ways was an impetus to Busby coming as the first consul, and then to eventually to the British wanting to establish a treaty and put some controls over the European population. There are 17 ships alone in that painting there, so you can imagine sort of carrying on with the number of sailors that have arrived in this little town. So we know about the treaty. The treaty was signed in 1840, and I guess there was a degree of optimism, maybe that this was going to work, but things unravelled quite quickly. So within 5 years we had a war in the same place, and that's Honey Hickey shaking hands with Captain Hobson, who became the first governor. Well, his replacement, Captain Fitzroy, and Hickey are the chief protagonists 5 years later in this war that we're going to be talking about. So things went downhill quite quickly. After the treaty was signed, there was rapid immigration into New Zealand. The top picture there is Wellington, but the other ones are just general pictures. So a large number of Europeans came into the country. If you think about, I often say, you think about Oliver Twist, you think about Charles Dickens, what England was like at the time. It had gone through the agricultural revolution. People had come into the cities. There was squalor in these big industrial cities. People's lives were pretty miserable. The Irish potato famines of the 1840s. There were lots of good reasons to seek a new life on the other side of the world. People would go to Canada and Australia and, of course, New Zealand. So a lot of immigration. Of course, they want to start a new life. They put all their eggs in this basket, and they are looking for land, and they're looking for opportunities. So there were some early tests of authority. It's all very well establishing a colony and saying, okay, we're now the administration, but how do you actually run a place like New Zealand? How do you actually, and what are the rules, and what is the extent of the power of the governor, and what is the extent of the power of the chiefs? And if we think about the treaty, and I won't go into it because that's the topic for next week, but Rangatiratanga, chieftainship, where are those boundaries and how is this going to play out? So, for instance, there was intertribal fighting here in Tauranga in 1842. What's the responsibility of the governor? Is he to send troops? Is it his responsibility to sort out fighting between tribes? Is he even able to do that? And if he doesn't, where does that place him? And actually, in this case, they did send troops down here to mediate between some fighting that was going on. There were issues over land. Now, the colony had no way of making a living. It had no income. And one of the things that was in the treaty was that the preemption of land. Land sales were going to be controlled by the government. The government was going to take its 10%, and that's partly how the colony was going to be funded. This was very unpopular with the New Zealand Company and also with the chiefs, and Governor Fitzroy had to scrap it quite early on. So, but the government tried to control land sales because it thought a lot of unfairness was taking place. Now, chiefs didn't want that. They didn't want some governor arriving and telling them that they could no longer sell their own land. So there's a conflict there. It was also over the sale of kauri because the government tried to put controls around the sale of kauri. You may know about the Wairau Affray. It used to be called the Wairau Massacre near Blenheim. It's now, we call it the Wairau Affray. And that was an argument over the control of land when the Nelson colony, the settlers tried to expand into the Wairau Valley. That land had been conquered by Te Rokaraha, and in the end it ended up as a fight where a party of surveyors landed and tried to survey the valley, and 22 Europeans were killed, most of them who had who had surrendered. And this fellow here, Rangatiratanga, who was Te Rokaraha's nephew, executed them because his wife had been shot in that little fracas. And so, how do you sort that out? Who's right and who's wrong? Whose justice prevails? Was he correct? And Fitzroy, when he arrived, inherited this situation, and he realised that he had no ability to impose British law in this situation because he just didn't have the resources. And so, in the end, he appeared to be very weak. And Maori chiefs, including Hone Heke, looked at this and thought, well, this is, what's going on here? This is not quite what we thought we were getting. And then there was another little issue. These are just some of the issues. There was the hanging of a chief in the Bay of Islands called Makatu. He's often described as a minor chief, but he was a young man who killed a European family of 6. I think it was a mother and children. And so this was in 1842. Who's going to deal with this? This chief or the British authority, this new law that is trying to come in? And apparently his family agreed that he would be dealt with by the British law. He was put in a cell or a cage from a Maori perspective, and he was eventually hanged. Now, what does that tell you about chiefs and the role of chiefs, the role of the law? These are just conflicts that were just there and they were simmering. And they were, in some ways, they were almost irreconcilable. And so eventually the trouble moves north, up to the Bay of Islands. Now we've got Hone Heke there in the middle, and Hone Heke becomes the main person in this war, obviously. On the left is his second wife. His first wife died of illness, so that's Hariata, his second wife, and Kawiti, who's the other chief that is the main protagonist in this war. Now, Hone Heke's main grievances that were specific to the Bay of Islands, the capital had moved. So when the treaty was signed, Hone Heke, or in that period around there, Hone Heke was making £5 per ship. He was levying ships that were coming into the bay, and of course the Maori were trading, they were doing very well. When the capital moved to Auckland in 1841, which they hadn't foreseen, there was an economic collapse, and the prosperity that they had enjoyed suddenly just went away. And so there was the provisioning of the ships and all this sort of thing just died away. And so that was not what they had expected. The issues around chiefly authority, he was particularly concerned that the governor had now assumed the sort of power that had formerly been in the hands of the chiefs, and you can see those issues there. There was a widespread disillusionment with the way things were working out, even within a few years of the signing of the treaty. He was opposed to the government and to the idea of the governor, but not necessarily Europeans. In fact, he was on good terms with Europeans. He'd gone to a mission school. His second baptismal name is Wiremu, after Henry Williams, and he protected the settlers during the wars, but he started to develop a real animosity towards the government. Now, it's possible that he was affected by other people, in particular the Americans. The American traders, the Americans had the majority of shipping into the bay, and the American consul was quite an important position. And they were traders, they were making a lot of money. They obviously didn't like the fact that the country had become a British colony, and they didn't like the fact that they had now lost out on a lot of trade. And it seems to be quite a lot of evidence that they were influencing Hone Heke and telling him that flag that now flew above the town was a symbol that he was now a slave to the British, and that the governor was now in control. And it got to the stage where he was actually flying the American Stars and Stripes from the stern post of his war canoe just before he eventually sacked the town. The other group was the French missionaries. Now remember, we've only just had the Napoleonic Wars. Some of the British missionaries, such as Henry Williams, had actually been in those wars. Henry Williams was a naval officer. And so there's not only is there animosity at a nationalistic level between England and France, but at a religious level, they're fighting over the souls of the Maori. It's only 100 years earlier that they've been burning each other at the stake for being Roman Catholic. or Protestant, so there's an enormous amount of animosity there as well. Were the French undermining? I don't think the case is as strong, but there was a suggestion that the French missionaries were undermining the British government as well. This is the new governor who arrived. Governor Hobson had a stroke and died in 1842 after he lingered for a long time. And the colony just drifted for about a year, and eventually in late 1843 Captain Robert Fitzroy was appointed as the governor. And he came in and he inherited a situation that was going downhill very rapidly. I've shown him as a naval officer and also as a civilian there. Now the other key personality was Battle-Pukehinahina. Now he is from the other side of Ngāpuhi. He's from the Hokianga side. And there is a traditional enmity between the Taikokara side and the Hokianga side. And there's an old saying that when the spring flows in the Taikokara, it dries up in Hokianga. When it flows in Hokianga, it dries up in Taikokara. He's an older man, he's about 60. He has fought with Hongi through those musket wars. He is one of the leading chiefs. He spoke in support of the treaty and signed it, and was actually influential in convincing some of the others to sign the treaty on the 4th of February 1840. He swore at that stage that he would support the Crown, and he is continuing to support the Crown at this stage. So we've got this other theme going on here, which is a Ngāpuhi civil war. In fact, this may be bigger in some ways than the war between Hongi and the British, this parallel civil war that's going on. He is opposing Hongi. Now, the flag that was flying above Kora Rānarika was a signal flag. When you sail around the heads and into the harbour, you can see the flag from a long, long way away. It's on a hill called Maiki Hill. It was the Union flag, but it was actually a signal flag for shipping. It was also this flag that would dip at noon and all the ships would set their chronometers, so it had quite an important role. But he saw it as a symbol, and probably the Americans were telling him this, that it was a symbol that he was under subjugation now, his chiefly authority had gone, and Maori were essentially slaves to the British. And see, he discussed felling it for about 18 months. It became a topic that was brought up. Now the government, of course, saw this as an affront to the Queen. How can we do this? You cannot, burning a flag nowadays is bad enough, but back then, felling the flag was going to be an affront, and they were going to protect this flag. So Hiki became the standard bearer for disaffected Maori. There were a lot of Maori, a lot of chiefs in the area were unhappy with the way things were playing out. Some of them were prepared to give it a go to see what would happen. Some of them were in support of the new governor, but there were some who were unhappy with it. Hiki himself is often described as having a very complex personality, a very proud man. His whakapapa, his lineage was such that he was a very important person anyway, but he was someone who wanted to push himself forward, to be more important, to be a key player. That was just his personality. And he's been described as someone who would take offence easily as well. At this stage, he gathered a group around him. I'm probably talking about 1844 now, so about a year before the war breaks out. A group of about 250 young men. And he started to dispense justice. He started to place himself into situations of grievance. And he would sort it out. He would come in as the chief and he would deal with it. So the first one of these was the so-called Lord Affair. And he actually felled the flagstaff, or had the flagstaff felled 4 times. And each time it was felled, the tension grew and the situation ramped up. So there was a trader called Lord who lived on the beach at Kora Rānarika, and he was married to a Maori woman, and she insulted Hongi by comparing him to a pig. And as was traditional, as was custom, he descended on Lord's premises with a toa moru, a war party that was going to seek redress. And this was a customary way of dealing with things. And he, of course, they were burst in, they would have intimidated him and threatened him, and he had to pay something. And so he agreed to give a barrel of tobacco. But when that was opened, he had shortchanged Heki. So Heki's men went on the rampage. They stormed through the town, they did some damage, and he cut the flagstaff down. So this is the first time. About 6 months later, the flagstaff was cut down again. After the first one, I should say. So after this, there was a meeting. The governor came from Auckland, went to the Waimate mission station, met the leading chiefs. Heki wasn't there, but there was a meeting, and the leading chiefs, including Tamati Wakanehe, more or less guaranteed Heki's good behaviour and said that they would keep him under control. And the governor dropped the levy, the import levy, or the levies coming in, and so the town became a free port because the levy on shipping was hated. But that didn't stop Heki at all, and on the 10th of January he marched into the town again with his followers and felled the flagstaff a second time. And the night before he flagged it, he had felled it, he'd been at the American consul's house, and this is the time when he was flying the flag from the stern post of his war canoe and flying the flag in other places as well. So it's quite clear that he was getting revved up by the Americans. One of the Americans eventually gets arrested for gun running and ends up in jail in Auckland. On the 19th of January, the tension is rising still. The town of Kororareka is being guarded by so-called friendly chiefs or allies, but Heki comes through again with his men, and they step aside, not wanting conflict, and he fells the flag for a third time. Now from then on, Kawiti joins him. Now, he hadn't been involved in that stage, but they now come into the area and they camp near the town. More troops arrive from overseas, from Hobart and from New South Wales. The HMS Hazard, a ship that plays a big role in the battle, arrives, and the townsfolk, who are very worried about their safety, are drilled and armed. So what that really means is they're taught how to fire muskets. And there are strong points built around the town so that they can defend themselves. A temporary a portable blockhouse, if you like, comes across by ship, and it's put around the flagstaff, so the flagstaff goes up again. There was discussion about whether it should diffuse the situation by just leaving the flagstaff down. The first flagstaff actually had been donated by Heki himself. So he said, well, I'm not doing anything wrong, I've cut it down my own stuff. But the attitude was, no, we're going to put it up, we're not going to have an affront to the crown, and so it went up again, and this time it is sheathed in iron, quite a long way up. So this is the town on the eve of the battle. So on the 11th of March, the town was attacked. So here we have Mikey Hill. There's the flagstaff up there. It looks a lot bigger than it actually was, but it was up there. And there was a gun battery here. Down here was a house that one of the wealthier residents had stockaded his house and made it as a place for safe refuge for the townsfolk, specifically the women and children. This is the church that's still there, Christ Church, and this is Natavia Pass that leads through to the other side, through to the back. This is HMS Hazard. This is a little colonial schooner called the Victoria, and this is actually an American frigate called the St. Louis that sailed in the night before the town was destroyed. And I often wondered why that was. There's no suggestion, but it seems so strange to me that an American warship would arrive and then the town was attacked and burned the next day. But in actual fact, the captain of the St. Louis helped evacuate people. So what happened was, Kawati's group of about 200 came through Matavia Pass, and the British had a signal gun there. And before dawn, the crew of the Hazard, or a number of men from the Hazard, under the command of Acting Commander Robertson, had gone, and they were strengthening this position here. And all of a sudden, out of the darkness, they saw this group of warriors arrive, and there was quite a battle that took place. And they got pushed back, so Kawati's men pushed through, and they got pushed back. And those of you who have been to the church will know that there are musket holes in the walls of the church. So that's where the battle took place, around there. Now, at the same time, there was a group of about 20 soldiers inside the blockhouse around here, and some others had come out and were starting to build fortifications around the blockhouse. Hickey's men obviously saw them come out, counted out, they would have been watching for days, so they would have known what the routine of these men was. And they saw them come out, they counted them out, and when there were only a couple left, they rushed in, killed the remaining ones, and there was a signalman, Tapper, and a Maori wife who they let go, and I think Tapper's little 2-year-old daughter was killed. And before they even realised it, the men who were guarding this flag had actually lost it. So they came down here, down to this area here. And there was fighting and skirmishing in the town up until about lunchtime. And about just after lunch, a lot of people had come into this area here, and just about after lunchtime, the powder magazine, the gunpowder magazine in that stockade blew up. And there's a lot of speculation about whether that was an accident or whether someone thought, this is terrible, we're going to have to get out of here, let's blow it all up. And so that blew up, and then the townsfolk started to evacuate out into the ships. And the story is that some of the Maori actually helped them evacuate and carried their goods down to the beach. I think things hadn't played out quite how Hickey and Kawati thought. I think Hickey really was just wanting to throw the flagstaff again. But it ended up the town being abandoned, largely burnt, and then plundered. Commander Robertson was mortally wounded, and he's actually buried in the churchyard there. And so there was a very junior officer on the Hazard that then decided to bombard the town. And this seemed to have really angered the Maori, and they sort of went on the rampage. So there was a 3-day rampage, a lot of alcohol was drunk, a lot of things were looted, and a lot of buildings were burned. The next morning, on the 12th, those ships departed for Auckland and took the people back to Auckland. And you can imagine tales of woe when they arrived back in Auckland telling stories about how they've been driven out and how they lost all their possessions. And some people in Auckland at that stage actually panicked, sold everything, and headed back to Australia. And there was a fear that Honey Hickey was actually going to come and attack Auckland. I don't think that would have been possible, but that was what people were imagining. Some of you will have seen this. This is just the headstone from some of the men that were killed, some of the Europeans that were killed in the churchyard there. So if we just look, you might have trouble just seeing this, but I'll just give you an idea of the wider area of the Bay of Islands now. So here is Kororarika. Across the bay is Paihia. Now Paihia was the main missionary station. It's where new missionaries would come and they would be trained up and then they would go out further. Waitangi is just up here above the Waitangi River. The battles we're going to be talking about are Te Ahuahu, Pukitutu, Hawaii, and then eventually we'll typically review. And there was also an inland mission station. There was a mission station at Kerikeri, up here. And there was an inland mission station at Waima, which is right in the heart of Heki's area. This is where Heki was from. This is where Kawiti was from. Now, the British military these days was very much an early Victorian military. So they were firing flintlock muskets. The first ones that came here to New Zealand at this period were wearing the red jackets. And they were a military that individual soldiers weren't taught to use their initiative in any way at all. They were soldiers that would be moved around the battlefield by bugle calls, and they would advance and they would retreat and they would go off in certain directions. But you can see the way they are lined up there. This is the way they fought. And the Navy would also fight within in this case here, the Navy firing Congreve rockets. And these were an idea borrowed from the Chinese, actually. And they were really like a giant skyrocket. And they were the first generation of missiles. But it was the soldiers that came here had come from the Australian colonies, where they were looking after the prisoners, the convicts. So that's not to say they were troops. Some of them had not seen combat before, but their training hadn't prepared them to operate in the New Zealand environment. These are two of the ships that are quite important. This one up the top, I know it's hard to see, this one is called the North Star, and this one is called Calliope. In New Zealand we say Calliope, but it's actually, the pronunciation I think is Calliope. She was a Greek muse of music and beautiful sound. So the Navy played a big role because getting around New Zealand and getting around the coastline was incredibly difficult. And so the Navy was very important. And here we are at the bottom of the world, and the supply chains were supplied by these tiny little ships. They're not even really warships. They're certainly not the sort of warships that would have been used in the Napoleonic Wars. They're very small warships. It's almost jumbo diplomacy. But they are the sort of warships that can be used in the colonies when the enemy they are fighting doesn't have a navy at all. And of course Maori had no navy. So these are actually very powerful in the sense that, look at the top one there. It's only 35 metres long. It's got a crew of 175 and it's got 28 guns. These are the very last wooden warships, because by the 1860s in New Zealand we had, the very last complete sail warships, because by the 1860s we had auxiliary steam engines. So the plan was, the British came back and reoccupied Kororareka and called it Camp Victoria. And the plan was to try and arrest Heki. The first thing they did was sack Pomari's Pā. This was a rival place to Kororareka. This was also a place where ships were provisioned and where girls were provided and so on. And it was thought that he had a lot of plunder from the sacking of the town. So he was also thought to be sending letters to the Waikato chiefs asking them to be involved in the war. So here he is here at the mouth of the Kawakawa River. So that pā was plundered, was sacked, and then the expedition was going to go and land near Kerikeri and go on to Pukitutu. Eventually they found the information was that Hongi Heki had returned to and had built a pā at Pukitutu. So the troops sailed from Kororareka and landed near Kerikeri. They were met by Wakanane's men and they were guided through to Pukitutu. But the first night there was a torrential rainstorm. They were dressed in heavy woolen clothing. They're trying to march four abreast through the countryside. All of their biscuit, which was their food, and their powder was wet. And so they actually had to go into the stone store, which was the mission depot at Kerikeri, and spend the night, dry out their powder, and then head off the next day. Eventually turned up at Pukehinahina where Pukehinahina had provided some shelter and some potatoes. But they were very poorly provisioned. And it really makes me wonder, they were under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Hume. It makes me wonder what he really was thinking. I think there was a belief that if the British just turned up, Maori would run away because the British soldiers were invincible and they had this sort of reputation. So the Battle of Pukehinahina happened on the 8th of May. Heke had built a pā of scoria stone. So there's a lot of volcanic stone in and around this area. Even if you go there today, you'll see that some of the fences and the farms are made of these scoria boulders, the volcanic boulders. So his pā was largely scoria rock, although it did have palisades on it as well. Though the 58th and 96th Regiment had come from Australia, and Heke and Kariti both fought in this battle. And the British were completely out of their depth, and they learned some pretty harsh lessons in this particular battle. Colonel Hill didn't know where he was going. He didn't know anything about the route. He had no maps. He didn't know how Maori fought. He didn't know how the pā was constructed. He didn't know how to capture a pā. All he could do was follow Pukehinahina as he led him there. He was in a very vulnerable situation. He could have been ambushed at any time, but Heke and Nene had made an agreement not to conduct ambushes. And when they got there, they did a reconnaissance of the pā, and they found, I'll go to the next picture actually. I'll just tell you this, in this battle, 30 Maori were killed and 50 were wounded, and Kariti lost his son, and the British lost 14 killed and 40 wounded. But this is what the battle looked like. So it's a little bit washed out, but we didn't have photographs then. So here's the pā, and you'll notice it's sitting on low ground. The perspective is a little bit wrong, but there's the pā. And here are some British skirmishers firing at it from probably about 100, 120 metres. The British plan was to fire the rockets to try and scare the Maori away. They thought they were very superstitious and they thought these rockets would get them. Some Maori believed that the rockets had the ability to seek a person out and destroy them. But when Lieutenant Egerton of the Navy actually fired the rockets, they were a complete disaster. They just went across the pā and they didn't amount to anything. So from the Maori perspective, or from Heke's perspective, that meant a good omen, and it meant that their prayers had gone well, the gods were looking after them, and the battle was going to go well. And so here we have the British troops wading through the lake, along the edge of the lake, and getting up into the high ground here. And they are planning to assault down onto the pā. In the military, that's called a forming up place, or an FUP. So they went up into the FUP, and they were just getting sorted out, ready to assault down, probably about 150 metres down onto the pā, and they were attacked by Kariti, whose men were in the bushes. And this is where the main battle took place. Kariti had a couple of hundred warriors there, and there was quite a battle that took place there. And the way that Maori traditionally fight in the open is that they take on one individual man, because the Maori warrior is basically a martial artist. And he's going to take on an individual man, and his ability with his weaponry and his quickness and skill, he's either going to kill the guy or be killed himself. But the British don't fight like that. They fight in small groups. They have an enormous musket with an 18-inch bayonet, and they are drilled and drilled and drilled, and they know exactly how to fight, and they move forward, and so they actually got the better of Kariti's men, and that's why so many of them were killed. However, during the battle, you can just see here perhaps Heke's men sally out from the pā, and they come out and help, and then they go back in again. and it looks like there was signalling between Kawiti and Heke with the flags there as well. Eventually the withdrawal is sounded and the British troops come back, and they have to, they come back with no food, and then the next day they have to try and make their way back to Kirikiri and then back to their home base. And it was a very salutary lesson to them. A little bit later on, about a month later, there was another battle at Te Ahuaru. Now, Te Ahuaru was a great big volcanic cone in this area that some of you may have seen. And this was a battle just between Ngāpuhi. So this was a battle between Heke and Kawiti's men. The British weren't involved. So this is that Ngāpuhi civil war that I was talking about. And this was a battle in the open. Heke seems to have got intelligence that some of Nana's men had gone back to Hokianga. And so Nana had about 150 men, Heke had about 300. And Heke thought this is an opportunity to attack, to destroy his enemy, and by destroying Nana, he would also essentially destroy the British military effort as well, because they were no good without Nana at this point. And so Heke attacked. Nana's men were in an unfinished fortification, but they got the better of it, and they actually drove Heke's men away. Several of Heke's leading chiefs, and when I talk about Heke and Nana, there were obviously lots of chiefs who were fighting with them, but other personalities that come forth. And it was actually thought that Heke had died. He was shot through the thigh with a musket ball, and he was very, very sick. The rumours went out that he'd actually been killed, but he hadn't, but he was very, very ill. And we don't hear of Heke in this war until virtually the last day. So Kawiti now carries the fight. There was a lull in the fighting. There was an amphibious operation taken to the Kapatai Pāru behind Kororaraka, which was a complete disaster. And then, so the British were just in real trouble. None of their commanders had been able to win, and the British military had lost any reputation it had. And then Colonel Henry Despard arrived. He was a senior officer in the Australian colonies, and so the situation had deteriorated to the extent that he came over. And he has a terrible reputation. He is sort of derided. He was a grumpy old man, probably not as old as me, but he was a grumpy old man. He had sinus. He was a righteous old bigot. He didn't want to listen to anybody at all. And he is now the commander of the British troops. And even though it is now midwinter, he decides to campaign against Heke again. And I don't think he realised at this stage that Heke was out of business, and so he eventually ends up campaigning against Kawiti. And so Kawiti had gone to Ohaiwai. So that is in this area here. And he had taken over an old pre-musket war pa and strengthened it. And so the British followed a similar track that they had last time. They went from Kororaraka through the Kirikiri, but originally the British troops had kept away from the mission stations because they didn't want to put the missionaries in a compromising position, because the missionaries were there for the benefit of the Maori. But Despard didn't care, so he used Waimati mission station as his base. He arrived here. The soldiers burnt all the fence palings for firewood. They ate the pigs and the poultry. They took over the place. Reverend Burrows, who was in charge, was horrified. And then they made the blacksmith start to make bar shot for the guns as well. So very little subtlety about the situation. But from Waimati, and actually Heke arrived at the Waimati mission station. And some of his men were actually able to recover 2 cannons that were thrown into the mill pond, so the Maori wouldn't get them, but they knew they were in there and they got them out and they were used at Pā-Pukehinahina. That's Highway. So eventually the troops marched to Highway and they are confronted by a pā. Now this is quite an interesting pā. This is the pā that Kāwati had built. Now, you probably originally think that the Maori pā looks like this. This is what I have in my mind when I think of the pā. You fortified a hill or a river bank or something like that, and you put terraces and palisades, and it was very hard to get through there. And men would stand on fighting platforms where they would throw things down on the attackers. And a pā like this was usually taken by siege. You would usually starve the people out, or maybe subterfuge. But imagine if you may not be able to see, but imagine if you're standing on this platform up here, or if you're standing anywhere around here, and your enemy has a musket. You're going to be shot. So in these pā, height or elevation is important because Maori only had handheld weapons. They didn't have any projectile weapons. But as soon as your enemy has a projectile weapon, you have to go to ground. And this is the process that happened during the musket wars. Maori were already developing this technology. So this was an extension of that, this evolution of the pā design. So what this pā had was a double palisade, and the men were able to be in a trench and poke their musket through both palisades. There was also overhead protection, so you could sit in some sort of a covered area so that the musket balls couldn't get at you. And this is what you saw when you looked at the front of the pā. There was very strong posts, often pururi, which doesn't splinter when it's hit by a musket ball. There's flaps across the front so that you can't see into it, and any musket balls will be embedded in the flaps. And then down here are loopholes, which is where the muskets are pointed. So you can't actually see anyone. All you're going to see is the muskets sticking out. And here's a bird's eye view of the same pā, and there were tunnels and ways of walking around, getting around inside the pā. It was quite extraordinary. This is the British camp, and there's the pā in the background there. So what happened was Despard put some guns up here. He had some light guns. He put them up there. He bombarded the pā for about 10 days. The weather was appalling. The men didn't have tents. They didn't have actual food. There were Wakanaine's men were there as allies. And on 2 occasions, Despard decided he would attack the pā, but actually was talked out of it by his subordinates and by his Maori allies. And eventually he sent for a 32-pounder gun to come up from the ships in the harbour, because he needed a heavier gun to be able to batter down the palisades. The gun was put up here, and it started to have an effect. It started to knock the palisades down. So Kāwati sent a party out to attack the gun and to capture it. And Despard had to run for his life down here, and he was just furious when he got down to the bottom, because, man at his demons, he had to run down. And soon the flag that Kāwati's people had taken from up here was hoisted up in the pā, upside down, below what might have been some Maori underwear. So this was a terrible insult. So Despard announced an attack. 3 hours notice, and he was going to assault the pā. And people tried to talk him out of it. The subordinates, Wakanaina and his men, tried to talk him out of it, but he refused. Now, I'll just go quickly through here, but this is the sort of gun, that 32-pounder. It weighs a ton, so imagine dragging that up the muddy cart tracks and all the ammunition required for it. So this is the attack on the pā. Here you can see, what the pā looked like. You can see the loopholes along the bottom. And you can see the British, this is the forward position of the British. This thing is really impenetrable with what technology the British had at the time. The attack was launched, and they attacked basically in this area here. They had no scaling ladders, they had no ropes, they had no axes, didn't have any engineering equipment that would allow them to dig under and blow it up. And so what actually happened was they were just hacking away here, trying to get in. In fact, Lieutenant Philpotts from Hazard was so disgusted by what was happening that he took his uniform off, and he was in his long johns because presumably he didn't want to disgrace the uniform, and he was shot and killed. And then suddenly there was a cannon was fired from here, and it was loaded with bullet chain, and it just sized through the men and killed quite a number of them. And soon after that, the withdrawal was sounded. And so this was a complete disaster. And there were only about 100 defenders inside the palm. The death toll, about 10 Maori killed in that whole couple of weeks. We don't know about the injured. But the men there were about 270 soldiers who entered into the assault, and nearly half of them became casualties, dead or wounded. This is a church that is on the site now, so the pā was actually kind of in this area here. That story of war is the extent of the pā. The British soldiers are buried here, and this is where the British position was, and the guns were here. This is St Michael's Church. It's benefited from the Regional Development Fund. It's a beautiful church on the site if you get to go there. So Heki was convalescing in Napa Springs. Kawiti then moved to Ruapekapeka, and there was a period of peace negotiations. But Fitzroy was really arguing from a position of weakness. He'd lost 3 battles now, but he was offering peace terms that the flag would be re-erected, that the plunder from Kororareka would be returned, and that land would be given as compensation. Heki and Kawiti really weren't interested. They were just buying time while Ruapekapeka was being built. But what happened next was Fitzroy was recalled. So there'd been tremendous pressure from the New Zealand company and from settlers. There'd been a lobby to get rid of him. Fitzroy was actually quite pro the Maori position and was trying to sort of keep to what the treaty had more or less promised. But there was a real campaign waged against him. And yet also, the colony was now in real trouble. So he was replaced by Captain George Gray. Now, it's just gone over 12. Do we need a bit of a stretch?
Yep.
Okay, so should we have a little bit of a stretch, maybe a toilet break? 5 minutes? Okay, let's start please. I've probably got about half an hour to go, and we're coming up to the final battle. So Governor Gray was a completely different type of man to Fitzroy, and he arrived and hit the ground running, we might say, and he planned to attack Kawiti in Ruapekapeka, this famous pā site that we've probably all heard about. Gray had been an army officer, so I think that helped him, but he was also just sort of a much more assertive sort of personality than Fitzroy had been. And he very quickly summed up the situation and worked out how he would attack Kawiti. He made an alliance with Nene, whereas Nene's relationship with Fitzroy hadn't been very good and terrible with Colonel Despard. Governor Gray took him into his confidence, treated him as an equal. They made joint plans together and they confided in each other, and Gray was able to get a lot of information out of Nene and a lot of cooperation. And together they planned this campaign up to Ruapekapeka. So this is the site, or the part of Ruapekapeka, and it's an enormous site. You can see here where the cannons have actually blown some of the stockade away. But for about 4 months, Kawiti's people built this park. And it's in Kawiti's home area, and his whole tribes, or Haku's energy, would have been based around building this construction. I've worked out that there may have been up to 4,000 logs that were required to be felled and dragged into place. So they would have been dragged out of the forest behind. And it was an enormous park. The walls are high, it's double palisaded. Under each of these huts are bomb-proof shelters and also trenches, well not trenches, but tunnels where you can get right around the whole place underground. It was really quite an interesting construction. And you can see all of the angles there as well, which would allow you to fire on it. The only real way that the British could attack it was from the front, because it narrowed down a bit to the front. It was about 60 metres wide and 100 metres long, so it was an enormous park. But if you think of the economic effort required to build a thing like that, during spring and early summer, when you should be planting your crops, and you're building a park like that, the economic cost for people who have to essentially, in this case, it's sort of like subsistence farmers, if you like, plus hunters and gatherers, against a professional army. You can't keep repeating this, so this is a huge effort. So if I just go back to that route, it was quite a complicated route from Kororareka through to the head of the Kawakawa River, and there was a chief called Pukututu who had a pā here, which became a depot. So this was a big operation. The ships would come as far as they could to the Kawakawa River, and then the stores would be rowed up to Pukututu's pā, and then they would be taken from there up to Ruapekapeka. It took the troops a month to get up to Ruapekapeka. They had to, at times, 40 to 50 men towing a gun, as well as 8 oxen were used to tow the guns. It was an enormous effort. Wakanene helped provision the troops, and his men showed the British soldiers how to live in the bush, how to build shelters, and how to basically how to survive. So there was a lot of interaction between the two forces. Eventually they arrived up at Ruapekapeka in late December, and they were ready to begin to attack it. And as he had it a highway, you can't see this, but as they had it a highway, Despard started to bombard it. He had 1,150 troops, 12 guns and 4 mortars. So he had a whole lot more equipment than he had previously. When Governor Gray arrived, he was given money or finance and men that had been denied to Fitzroy. The British government realised that they had to pour more resources into this war. The British set up a base about a kilometre away and started bombarding the park, and then got closer and closer. And this is the main, what we would call a fire base. Now, and they were just bombarding the Pā. But as in the past, it wasn't a full barrage, it was just shots fired in from time to time, just to keep the defenders' heads down. But if you look at the picture of the Pā, here it is here, just in that area there. It has one vulnerability, and it's what military people would call forward slope. So it's sitting on the front of a hill. When you are defending a hill, you can defend the front, the forward slope, the top, or the back, which we call the reverse slope. And it just depends on the tactical situation and the weapons you've got and the weapons your enemy has got. As this worked out, this is probably the worst case scenario for Kāwiti, because the Pā was sitting on about a 20-degree angle, and so the British gunners could see into it. He hadn't really had to think about artillery in this sense before, but this was a weakness for the Pā that actually proved to be fatal. So the gunners were able to select their individual targets when they were shooting at the Pā, and they could see the damage that was being done. So what probably was the case is that Kāwiti's men would spend most of the day, and women as well in this Pā, out the back, ready to come in if the Pā was actually attacked. They would have been out the back just to avoid being bombarded. Nene's men patrolled those steep slopes on either side of the Pā, so they basically cut it off. And one of the chiefs was given the job of keeping Honiheki away, so they kept Honiheki's force away, well away from the Pā. Eventually, the position moved forward, and you can see this is the Pā here, and this is the front position. Here's a British gun here. And on the 10th of January, Despard decided that he would attack again, and he would attack. He had knocked the breach in the front of the Pā, and he thought he would attack. But Nene's men said to him, or Nene said, "Don't attack today, we think that they are abandoning the Pā." And in fact, the Pā had been being abandoned for quite a few days, because the effect of this intermittent bombardment was making it unbearable in the Pā. If you're underground, and the concussion from those shells is landing on you, specifically the mortars that were landing, your eardrums would blow out, you'd be bleeding from the nose. Apparently the worst thing was when the mortars would land, you would hear them land, and then there would be a period of time before they would off. And so it really wasn't sustainable to live underneath the ground when it was going on. So Despard decided not to, and so the next morning on the 11th, the Wakanene's men and the British troops, some of them crept up, and that's what we can almost see in this picture here, and went through the entrance of the Pā. And they found that it was undefended, and they were able to make their way up through the Pā. And then the story goes that one of Wakanene's men rang a bell, and that alerted Kāwiti and his people who were out the back, Whether that's true or not, we don't know. But they were able to get right through the Pā. It appears that Kāwiti and a small group were right at the back of the Pā, and they fired a shot, or fired some shots, and then they went out through the back. The troops pushed through, and out the back of the Pā, the sailors leading, and the argument is that the sailors were perhaps more impetuous than the soldiers, and there was a battle out the back of the Pā. And in that battle lasted for 2 or 3 hours, and then Kāwiti's force withdrew, and the Pā was left in the hands of the British. And over the next few days, the Pā was burned down and destroyed. So 2 weeks of intermittent shelling. Despard really hadn't learned very much, but it was a Sunday when the Pā was taken. So there's the death toll: Maori 20 killed and 30 wounded, British 12 killed and 30 wounded. Now, there's a lot of theories about why this enormous Pā fell as it did. One of the theories is the Sunday prayers theory. You may have heard that. So being a Sunday, the argument goes that Kawiti, even though Kawiti wasn't a Christian, he thought that the British soldiers would not attack on a Sunday. They wouldn't disgrace the Sabbath by attacking. But in actual fact, they had fought on previous Sundays. And I think this story developed from the missionary lobby. And the missionaries certainly were no fans of the military. They saw them as drunken fornicators. They didn't want anything to do with them. So the story went out that they had despoiled the Sabbath. But I don't think that argument holds up. And certainly historians recently have been saying this. If you go up to the Far North, people will tell you that the British did the dirty and attacked on a Sunday, and the Maori were at church out there. But I don't think Kawiti was such a fool that he would leave his pa open and gaping with 1,150 British soldiers and Nene's men who had spent a month getting there, who were determined to come in and kill them all. He wouldn't have sort of thought, oh, well, they won't do it on a Sunday because they're God-fearing people. So I don't buy into that one. Another possibility is that Heki arrived the night before. He finally eluded the troops, the warriors that were keeping him in check, and he entered the pa the night before, on the 10th. And apparently he and Kawiti had a heated discussion, and Kawiti accused Heki of having lost his taste for the battle. But these are obviously just second-hand stories, but it may be that they decided that they would withdraw and fight the battle out back. And so the British sort of felt that there were pre-prepared positions out the back. And so when those sailors and soldiers burst out the back, chasing the Kawiti's group, they were attacked, and that's where the battle took place. So that's a possibility that there was an ambush out the back. The third possibility is that the pa was actually just being evacuated because the bombardment had been so severe and so devastating that they had actually it was untenable to stay in the pa anymore, and the pa was captured. And the evidence for this is that large groups had been seen leaving the pa in the previous days, and some Maori had actually come out and spoken to the troops and said, why are you doing this? You've been roasting us behind for a month. Haven't you had enough? When the pa was eventually captured, there were no supplies in it. There was no food and there was no equipment. So the pa was obviously being evacuated. Now, when you evacuate a position, you often have what we call a stay-behind party. So a group will stay behind and hold up the pursuers to let the rest get away, to make a clean breakaway. And it's possible that what actually happened was that they were evacuating the pa. Remember, Nene said that they thought it was going to be evacuated the next day. And that Kawiti and his group had held them up. They'd been the stay-behind party at the back. They'd held them up for 3 or 4 hours, allowed the main group and the women and so on to get away, and then they had disappeared into the bush. So my money is probably on the third, but you will find people who will put forward those different opinions. So this is Real Peka today. There were some bad omens about this at the start of the battle. When the battle opened, there were some celestial symbols that seemed to be in the sky, and that was taken as a bad omen. And then one of the first British cannon shots hit the cannon there and wrecked it, and that was also taken to be a bad omen. But you can see how high it is. It's 300 metres above sea level. You can just make out the bay in the distance, actually. It's just an extraordinary place to go and have a look if you can. I was up there in June with this gentleman. He showed me around. This is Peter Tiffany, who was the chairman of the Anglican Trust and also of the local couple. And he's a direct descendant of Kawiti. So that's Kawiti in the middle of the gate there. So he's standing with his descendant. And they've spent an awful lot of money. Once again, like St Michael's at a highway, The government has put a lot of money into the Regional Development Fund here. So the place is really well looked after, including the Prime Minister. This is the grave to the 12 soldiers, and this is just done in the last few years. So this is rather a nice touch, I think, where the local people have found the grave of those 12 soldiers and built really quite an impressive memorial to them. I think that's the Defence Minister talking as well. So, who won the Northern War? Well, both sides at this stage were prepared to make peace. Kawiti said he's prepared to fight on if the government wants to fight, but he's prepared to make peace if he wants to fight. Kawiti had been fighting for his dead, and he'd lost his son as well, but he had now was prepared to make peace. Apparently Heke's people were prepared to make peace as well. Remember that Heke had been fighting about the British control. Well, those reasons had really been lost because the bay was now full of warships, full of soldiers, Europeans were everywhere, and the reasons for starting the war in the first place had kind of been lost. Things had changed quite dramatically. Nene had a reconciliatory meeting with Kawiti and Heke. They met at Palmaro's Pā, and they made peace. They decided not to fight anymore. Nene went to Auckland and spoke to Grey, and on Nene's advice, Grey decided that there would be no confiscations and no recriminations. Everyone was absolved of any wrongdoing. Under Governor Fitzroy's plan, land had to be given up, but Grey didn't do that. So everyone's mana was intact. And I mean that phrase there, no one was eaten. The British hadn't eaten anyone. And I know that sounds a terrible thing to say, but that apparently was quite a significant. There was no need for utu. It was just all let go. And so things just really were just allowed to settle. The Flagstaff was allowed to lay prone until 1858, after Heke's death, well after Heke's death actually, and it was then re-erected by Kawiti's son as a gesture of good faith. And when we think about the people in this war, no one comes out of it with a bad reputation. Kawiti was loved by his people, and his reputation is enormous, both of Maori and Pakeha. Heke's reputation, he remained a very powerful person. He wrote letters. He gave up the physical fighting, but he started to fight with the pen and kept advocating. Nene became a very powerful and influential person in the colony. All had great money. And the north remained quiet. Now, some areas in New Zealand where there has been fighting, such as in the Taranaki or on the east coast, it comes back again. Poor old Taranaki saw warfare for decades. But in the north, the warfare ended. There was the little dog tax war at Wawani in the late 1890s, but that was really nothing much good. But that's not to say that things happened that weren't good, and certainly Ngāpuhi have had trouble even all agreeing on what their treaty claims are, and we know that they haven't done that yet. But warfare didn't break out again. And when the wars of the 1860s, specifically the Waikato War, took place, the government never worried about Ngāpuhi rising up and attacking Auckland from the north. So just to finish off, some of the key leaders, I can't remember all these details, so it's interesting what happened to these people. So during this war, Kawiti was about 70 years old. As I said, he reconciled. He eventually met the governor. Some say he was baptised by Henry Williams just before he died in 1853, and he died in 1854. and apparently his tummy lasted a year. Heki was in his late 30s during the war. He's a younger generation, so he, unlike Kawiti, who was an older, and Nene as well, Heki was a child of the mission schools. So he'd gone through the mission school. He understood the Europeans much better. He lived in that world as well as his own. He reconciled with Nene, and later, about 2 years later, he met with Gray, and they kind of agreed to get on with each other a little bit. He was still very powerful and influential until his death, but he died of tuberculosis in August 1850. Wakanene was an older man. He was in his 60s during this war. He became, I would say, if anyone came out of this war the best, he probably did. He became a friend and an advisor to Gray and to the government. He became a mediator. He would accompany Gray around the country and intercede in disputes and so on. He had great prestige in Mana. He was given land just in the middle of Kororarika or Russell. If you go there now, there's a little place called Nene's Cottage. You can see the remains of it. And he was buried in the churchyard at Christ Church, the church in Russell, modern day Russell. And there's a great big, the biggest monument in the churchyard is to him. And there were 12 very important European pallbearers apparently. So in some ways he was, his mana was across both races. And he's buried there, and he died in 1871. Fitzroy had a tragic story. He was about 40 years old in 1845. He was of the senior aristocracy. He was quite an extraordinary man. He had been the captain of the Beagle when Darwin did his 3-year circumnavigation of the world. And they'd actually called into Kororarika in 1835. And the locals had actually tapped Darwin for £10 to help build the church. And that amuses me because all of his work later on was against the, I guess, help sort of break down Christianity. He went, after being relieved of his, of being a governor, he went back to England and he became a senior naval officer in command of the Woolwich docks. He became a vice admiral in 1863, and he actually invented modern weather forecasting. He was given the job of setting up a way of knowing the weather, and he literally invented modern weather forecasting. But he never got over having been recalled. He never was knighted. He lived with the shame of being recalled. He's a man of his aristocratic background should have been given honours that he wasn't, and he became very depressed and took his own life in 1865. And the last one, Governor Gray, his first term was considered quite successful, and he handled the race relations situation in New Zealand with quite a lot of nuance. He was knighted in 1848, and he returned as governor again in 1860, when once again the country was in a race relations crisis with the Taranaki War and then with the Waikato War. The second time as governor is judged a lot more harshly, and he was responsible really for the confiscation of nearly 300 million acres of non-land. Is it million or thousand? I think it's million. And then later on he was the Premier of New Zealand, so twice governor, once Premier, and he died in London in 1898, having lived a very interesting life. So that's as far as I want to go on the Northern War. That's just a taster. As I have gotten older and wiser, I've realised that lots of people have different perspectives on things. We might agree on what the facts of what actually happened, but the interpretation of those events and the way that different groups understand them are quite different. And I guess we just have to accept that that's the way things are. Any questions? Any thoughts?
We never learn.
Sorry?
We never learn.
We never learn, no. But isn't it interesting that a lot of the issues that Connie Heki was talking about are still issues today. Yeah. See?
I was just wondering about the American influence, which did the Americans sort of withdraw, or what happened?
So the question was about the American influence. So the first American consul was a guy called Green, and he was replaced by Wakefield. And Wakefield was the guy who was influencing Hickey the most, I think. And he was arrested and jailed in Auckland for gun running and for bringing supplies into Hickey. So I'm not sure beyond that what actually happened, but the American influence just seems to die away.
That might have discouraged.
Yeah. Yes.
From what I've heard you say and read elsewhere, it seems that a major problem was the British, having signed the treaty in 1840, didn't have enough follow-up and support the governors with troops and discipline and that type of thing. Things may well have been a lot different.
Yeah.
Had that happened.
Well, as I said at the start, it's all very well saying, okay, this is now a British colony. But how do you, it's a long, thin country, they've only got sailing ships, they've got 80,000 Maori. When Governor Hobson arrived, he had 4 New South Wales policemen as a personal bodyguard. He had no troops, he didn't have a ship, he had nothing. And then the executive arrives, and you've got a team of about 5 men. You've got a lawyer, you've got someone who's going to do surveying, a few other things. You can't manage a colony or establish a colony on that basis. And of course now we're starting to understand different interpretations of the treaty. Once again, I won't go into that. But the latest thinking is that Maori didn't actually cede sovereignty at all. And that's certainly, now I traditionally thought that was the case, that we had. I think we all grew up thinking that. You can ask Alistair about this next week. But the Waitangi Tribunal has said for quite a while now that Ngāpuhi did not cede sovereignty. And so people like Hickey, what did they actually think? What were they signing? And what happens when that treaty arrives here in Tauranga and either Brown or some ship's captain who doesn't know anything about it gets people to sign it and hands out a few blankets? What are people understanding about what this is all about? And the role of the chiefs now, and their authority, and what they may have signed away, or what the governors thought they applied. It's all very confusing. Just one minute.
What was Hobson's choice?
I think Hobson's choice relates to that saying, we are all now one people, hei iwi katoa, or something like that. Yeah, I think that's what it relates to. Someone had taught him that phrase before. And so some people will say, well, we are all one people. That's that phrase.
You mentioned the French were involved. Is that right? One stage during the treaty either?
Yes.
All right. Cardinal Galati actually was a part of that. And he translated into Maori for the English and for the Maori. Is that correct or not?
Bishop Pompalia.
Yeah.
Yes. So Bishop Pompalia arrived. The British missionaries had the upper hand. They arrived in 1814. That's the Anglican ones, the CMS, and the Methodist ones arrived in 1823, and they got on quite well. The Roman Catholics arrived in 1838, and they initially went to the Hokianga, and then they came across to Kororaraka. And Bishop Pompalia tried to establish a mission station there, and a lot of Maori were attracted to the Roman Catholic version of Christianity. He was a bit of a key player around the day of the signing of the treaty, and there was always this suspicion that the French were up to no good. There was actually a French, the Bordelais company. It was actually, just as we had the New Zealand company, which set in parts of New Zealand, was a private settlement company. There was a French one that arrived as well, and it sailed into the harbour in Koro-Ranrika, and to the captain's horror, realised that it had become a British colony about a month beforehand, so he was just a bit late. He sailed in to pay his respects to Bishop Pompalia before sailing to the South Island. And so Governor Hobson quickly dispatched a ship down to the South Island and held a court case down there, which was seen in international law as an expression of sovereignty. So by the time the French arrived down there, they were really only left with the opportunity to set up something in Akaroa. So they missed out on settling part of New Zealand. There was actually another guy too, Baron de Terry. Baron de Terry had done a deal. He thought he had purchased 40,000 acres of the Hokianga, and he was going to come to Hokianga and be the king. And he arrived expecting that he would have this little kingdom that he was going to be in charge of. And he was sort of rudely, he realised what he missed out on. But this was part of the reason why the British eventually signed the treaty, because the French were starting to move into New Zealand. There were French warships in our waters, and there was a realisation that the French were moving around.
In my opinion, I feel that New Zealand was quite lucky having the British as a police force. You know, and I think Māori saw the British as that. Had 1500s, Tasman, had Tasman come in, and the Dutch and Portuguese had inhabited New Zealand. I don't think we would have Māori here today, just like what happened in South America.
So the gentleman said that he thinks it was good that the British came when they did, because Tasman had come earlier and the Dutch had taken over New Zealand. Things would have been... There's the Portuguese, yeah. I think it's generally accepted that the early colonisation, or the exploitation in places like Central America and so on, that was very, very harsh. And there was a book written a while ago where an American scholar talked about two British empires. The first one was the British Empire in North America and India, which was harsh. The second empire was the later colonies, such as New Zealand, and that came after the Enlightenment. It came after the anti-slavery movement. It came after the legislation around work systems for women and children and things like that. So the empire was a lot gentler, and so the colonies that were settled at that time were different. That's not to say, however, that I mean, when you look at it, the British did it right here, and a lot of land was confiscated. So I don't think a lot of Māori would particularly agree that that was a good thing. But certainly there was a difference in tone between.
What did not the Māori confiscate land? Ngāpuri came down here,
Yes.
from here,
Yes.
from there.
Definitely. Māori in those days were conquering each other as well. Absolutely, definitely. Yeah.
Will the full treaty touch on covering about Confederated chiefs?
Probably. So the question is, will the talk on the treaty talk about the Confederation of Chiefs?
Because I think, I don't know enough about it, but some people hearing about it.
Yeah.
As I understand that that's been a big part of treating issues in Northland because of that area establishment of that group.
Yeah. So Alistair can talk about that. But in 1835, a group of Northern chiefs, partly in response to the French and partly in response to the lawlessness, got together and under Busby's perhaps direction or encouragement, and declared New Zealand as an independent nation. And partly they needed that so they could sail into the Australian ports with the flag of New Zealand as well. So that a lot of people see that as the first step, the first time New Zealand declared itself to be an actual independent sovereign nation. Yeah. So anyhow, I'll leave that for Alison. Perhaps the last question?
Yeah, what was the missionaries' view on the sacking of Russell? And did they have an influence in the Upper rebuild?
Okay, the question was, what was the missionaries' reaction to the sacking of Russell? Henry Williams was very worried. Henry Williams was at Paihia, Robert Burrows was at Waimati, and there were other Methodist missionaries around as well, Wesleyans. They were doing quite a lot of intelligence work, and they knew Heki and Kari, particularly Heki, and they were sort of testing the water and seeing what was going on and reporting back to the government. They did everything they could to stop the sacking of the town. And actually, the night before the sacking of the town, Henry Williams got on a rowing boat and rowed from Paihia to Rangrika to warn Beckham, who was the police magistrate, that the town was going to be attacked the next day. He tried to intercede with Heki in the days before the attack. So the missionaries were trying to promote peace all the way through. Okay, well, thank you very much for your... Sorry? Oh, I'm not vlogging the book, but... recommended price was $55, Massey University Press. I've got some copies, $40. I talk quite a lot about this. There's several chapters on this, so if you are interested, there's a few copies down there. I'll take to sign. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cliff. Yet again, another great talk. I appreciate the timing. And yeah, for those who want to read more and know more about that, please do buy this book. Paula has copies of that ready to go, so Paula and me, they'll be happy to organise that for you. So next week is Alistair Rees, and he'll be talking about the treaty from a reconciliation point of view. So some of you may have gone to the event at the end of last year, Three Voices, talking about the treaty. Alistair was one of the people talking there from a church perspective. It's interesting, Kiri Allen was also one of those there, and she said, well, she could talk from a church perspective, from a Māori perspective, and from a government perspective. So she can make all three. But Alistair, he spoke for about 20 minutes, so I've asked him to unpack some of what he talked about there and to extend that. So he's got the full 2 hours. I don't know that it'll take the full 2 hours, but I think he really wants to kind of explore what the treaty was about, how it came to be, and some of the consequences for us today as we look towards the future. So that's next Sunday, 7 o'clock here. I look forward to seeing you all then, and please invite them to come along as well. Thank you for those who left donations tonight, and we'll be accepting donations next week as well. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to seeing you next week.